The Empress expected him to plead. Instead, the human left. The guards did not ask me to kneel when I entered the throne room. They did not need to. Everything in that space was designed to make you do it on your own. The ceiling was 300 ft above my head, carved from a single piece of black crystal that had been pulled from the core of a dying moon. It caught light from 1,000 floating orbs and fractured it into cold blue ribbons that fell across the floor, like the fingers of something ancient. Reaching down, the walkway I stood on was narrow, barely wide enough for two people side by side, and it stretched for nearly half a kilometer before it reached the dais. Walls on either side dropped into open darkness. There was nothing below. They had built the floor this way deliberately. You cannot look to your left or your right without feeling the pull of that empty space. The only safe direction was forward. Toward her I kept my eyes forward. My name is Calvin Marsh, and I am 39 years old, and I am the only human being that Valeth Imperium has ever agreed to receive in an official capacity. I'm not a soldier, I'm not a scientist, I am a diplomat, which means I am a professional at walking into rooms where everyone wants something from me and leaving with something they did not plan to give. I had been in this room before, twice in the 3 years since my posting began. Both times have been ceremonial. Ribbon cutting for new trade agreements. Essentially the Empress present but distant, her court arranged around her like a decorative border. The whole thing over in under an hour, both times. I had felt the weight of the room and managed it. This time felt different. From the moment I stepped off the transit pod, it was the silence. The chrysalis throne held a court of nearly 400 on formal occasions, every species with a trade relationship with the Imperium sent at least one representative, and most sent delegations of 5 or 6. I had counted them before, back when I was still finding my footing, and counting things helped me feel in control. On a normal day, the sound before a session was a low, steady hum, the noise of many different kinds of beings occupying the same space, their translation devices clicking and murmuring their ambient sounds, overlapping into something almost like a crowd at a market. Today there was nothing. 400 beings stood in absolute stillness and watched me walk. I had prepared for this summons for 18 hours. Director Elena Graves, my handler at the Earth Interstellar Commission, had called me the moment the Imperium's formal request arrived, and her voice had been very careful and very level, which meant she was concerned. She had told me the phrasing of the summons was unusual. Normally, the Valeth invited envoys to attend a session. This summons had used a different verb, one that translated most closely to the word convened, which in Valeth legal tradition carried the implication of a matter already decided. They had already decided something. They wanted me there to hear what it was. I had spent the flight from Helium Station reviewing everything I knew. I was not under any illusions about the relationship between Earth and the Valeth Imperium. We were useful to them, but we were small by galactic standard. 11 billion humans across 6 settled worlds was, in the context of an empire spanning 40 star systems and dozens of species, a population no larger than a single mid-tier colony. Our technology was capable but not exceptional. Our military was professional but not fearsome. What made us interesting, what had gotten us A seat at the table at all was. Geography and temperament, geography. Because his Kessel corridor, a navigable channel through the dense radiation field of the sheer nebula, ran directly through the edge of human-controlled space. Every major trade route between the Imperium's eastern and western clusters passed through that corridor. Without access to it, Valeth supply chains added between 6 and 9 weeks to every major shipping cycle, temperament. Because in the 3 years I'd been here, the Valeth had never encountered species quite like us. They were accustomed to dealing with civilizations that either submitted or resisted. They had strategies for both. Humanity had given them something they had no clean category for a species that was friendly, cooperative, and entirely unwilling to be managed. I had made good use of that confusion. Walk to the dais took 4 minutes at the pace I was keeping, steady, unhurried. Not slow enough to seem uncertain or fast enough to seem eager. I had practiced the walk, not in a way anyone needed to know about. I had walked the length of my quarters on the station each morning for a year, counting steps, adjusting posture until the movement was entirely natural. The Empress came into clear view at about the 200 m mark. Sarabeth Yul was tall, even for a Valeth, and the Valeth were already a head taller than the average human. She had the silver-gray coloration of her bloodline, skin that caught the light and seemed almost to hold it, eyes that were large and uniformly dark, with no distinction between iris and pupil. She wore the formal regalia of the chrysalis court, layered garments in deep violet and black, the chest piece set with stones that were not decorative but functional, each one a recording device, a communication relay, or a weapon. Her crown was not a crown in any human sense. It was a structure that extended from her temples and curved above her head in 2 arcs that met at a point and held suspended a single sphere of white light. She was watching me the way you watch something you have already decided how to handle. I stopped at the mark on the floor, a subtle etching in the stone that indicated where visitors stood. During formal address, I placed my hands behind my back, the standard neutral posture. I did not bow. Earth's diplomatic protocol with the Valeth explicitly did not include bowing. This had been negotiated in the original contact agreements, and the Empress knew it. The court knew it. It still made half the room tighten every time I did not bow. Good. The Empress's first voice, a thin official named Serv, who stood to her right, raised a long-fingered hand, and the room became even quieter, which I had not known was possible. Serv Ethelul spoke. Her voice was low and even, and it carried without effort in the crystalline space. She spoke in Old High Valeth, which was the ceremonial register used for judgments and proclamations, not for conversations. The translation came through the device in my ear half a second later in a flat, neutral voice that my brain had long since learned to hear as transparent. She began with a list. It was a long list. She called it a record of grievances, and she read it with the kind of deliberate calm that people use when they want you to understand that the emotion underneath is very different from the surface. 14 items. I had heard of 9 of them. Other 5 were new, which meant they were either fabricated for the occasion or they came from intelligence sources I had not known were active. I listened. I kept my face neutral. I filed each item away. The board violations were real, but Minor survey vessels that had clipped the edge of disputed space during a navigation error 3 years ago. The resource disputes were a reference to a conflict over mining rights in the Pelin Belt, which had been formally resolved 14 months ago and which they were now apparently choosing to resurrect. The trade imbalance claims were creative accounting. Infrastructure complaints were legitimate but had been addressed in writing 6 times. Then she reached the final item and the room shifted, not visibly, but I felt it the way you feel. A change in air pressure before storm. She said that Earth's continued refusal to submit its diplomatic personnel for cognitive reorientation represented an unacceptable rejection of Valeth partnership standards. Cognitive reorientation, that was their term for process I'd looked into thoroughly and found to be exactly as concerning as the name suggested. It was a neurological adjustment procedure applied to all non-Valeth diplomats serving in the Imperium. The official purpose was to optimize cross-cultural communication. The actual effect, based on everything Earth's medical team had been able to determine from the records of other species representatives, was a measurable reduction in independent decision-making and a significantly increased tendency toward agreement with Valeth positions. They wanted to adjust my brain so that I would be easier to work with. I had refused politely and in writing 4 times. She was now listing this refusal as a grievance. When the list was complete, Seraph stepped forward and read the terms. His voice was precise and without inflection, the way you read something that has already been decided. Earth would surrender administrative authority over 3 frontier systems, Pelin, Corin, and the Marsh Reach, which I had always found grimly amusing given my name. Valeth governors would be appointed within 90 days, all human vessels operating in Valeth adjacent space would register with Imperial Port Authority before transit, and I, Calvin Marsh, Earth's appointed diplomatic envoy, would perform a formal act of submission before the court. He described it plainly. I would kneel. I would lower my head. A member of the court would place a ceremonial marker on my shoulder. It would be recorded and transmitted to all 40 systems of the Imperium and shared with every species that had a relationship with the Valeth, as a formal demonstration of Earth's acknowledgement of imperial precedence. Sarah finished reading. The room waited. I stood there for a moment in the silence. The court expected tears or anger or desperate bargaining. I could feel it in the collective stillness. Held anticipation of watching something break. They'd seen this before. Every species that had ever been brought to this room for this kind of reckoning had responded the same way. They begged. They negotiated. They offered alternatives. They cried. They raged. They eventually, in one way or another, agreed. The Empress's dark eyes were on me with total calm. She had done this many times. She already knew how it ended. I pressed my fingertips together behind my back, a small gesture no one in that room could see. I thought of what Director Graves had told me, the one instruction she had given me for this exact kind of moment, delivered in the flat tone she used when she was being very serious. I thought of Kessel Corridor. I thought of the 18 months of quiet work I had done that no one in this room knew anything about. I thought of the 6 other species whose representatives I had very careful, very unofficial conversations with over the past 2 Years, and then I stopped thinking about all of it and just made the decision. I cleared my throat once, not to speak, just to let the room hear that I was about to. When I spoke in high Valyrian, not the old high register the Empress had used. That was ceremonial. And I was not performing a ceremony. I spoke in the formal diplomatic register, which was the register of equals, which was, I was quite certain, the first surprise of several I had prepared. For this afternoon, I said that I had heard the record of grievances and the proposed terms, and that I was grateful for the clarity with which they had been presented. Then I said that I would need a moment to consult my instructions. I reached into my jacket and removed a small card. It was blank. There were no instructions on it. It was a white card. I used to write reminders to myself and happened to have in my pocket, but I looked at it for 4 full seconds, and the entire court of 400 watched me look at it, and when I put it back in my pocket, the silence had changed texture entirely. I looked up at Empress Servith. I said, "I'm afraid I am not in a position to accept these terms." Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. I said it again in case the translation had been unclear. Then I said that I would be returning to my transit vessel and that I look forward to future dialogue when conditions were more conducive to mutual partnership. I turned around. I began walking back down the half-kilometer walkway toward the entrance, and behind me, for the first time in the living memory of anyone in that court, the throne room of the Crystal Palace was completely, totally, absolutely silent. I kept my pace exactly the same as when I had entered, steady, unhurried. My heart was doing something very fast inside my chest that I did not allow to show anywhere on my body. I did not look back. The silence lasted until I was approximately 40 m from the exit. Then it broke, not in an eruption of sound, but in a low, rolling wave of noise that built slowly behind me like water finding the edges of a container. I heard Serv's voice, sharp and clipped, giving orders. I heard the shuffle and shift of 400 beings who had just watched something they had no precedent for and were not entirely sure how to process. I heard 2 sets of footsteps behind me, heavier than mine, moving faster. I did not speed up. The 2 guards fell in a pace on either side of me at roughly the 30 m mark. They were Imperial sentinels, the Empress's personal security, tall, even for Valeth, armored and layered plates of the dark composite material the Imperium used for its heavy forces. They did not touch me. They moved alongside me in a way that was not quite an escort and not quite a block, occupying the space next to me with practiced precision. I acknowledged them with a glance. "Nothing more," I said, quietly and without slowing my pace. "I'm still a diplomatic envoy of Earth, under the terms of the Helium Accord, which the Imperium signed and which remains in force. Detaining me or impeding my departure would constitute a breach of that accord and would require a formal response from my government. I would hate for today's meeting to become even more complicated." I kept walking. The guards stayed with me for 8 more steps. Then they stopped. I did not stop. Exit doors were open. The transit corridor beyond them was lit in the flat white of station lighting, ordinary and institutional, after the theatrical drama of the throne room. My shuttle was 400 m down that corridor and 2 decks below. I walked through the doors. Behind me, I heard the throne room for The last time, the rising noise of a court that had just lost its script and was trying to find a new one, I turned the corner and let out a breath that I had apparently been holding for some time. My pilot, a quiet woman named Oren, who had been flying diplomatic shuttle for the commission for 11 years and who had the professional gift of not asking questions until the right moment, looked up when I stepped aboard. She read my face, or perhaps just the fact that I was alone and walking at speed, and began pre-flight checks without a word. I strapped in. I put my head back against the seat. The shuttle undocked 4 minutes later. As we cleared the Chrysalis Palace's docking ring and the full shape of the orbital structure appeared in the viewport, enormous, black, crystalline, rotating slowly against the star field. I looked at it for a long moment, then I pulled out my communication device and opened a line to Director Graves. She answered on the second signal. It was the middle of the night in Geneva, which told me she had been waiting. Calvin, she said. I did what you told me. I said. A pause. Did you kneel? No. Another pause. Longer. Did you stay? No. The line was quiet for 3 full seconds. Then Lena Graves made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sigh, and was entirely unlike anything I had heard from her in 3 years of working together. All right, she said. Tell me everything. Start from the walkway. I looked out at the stars and the shrinking silhouette of the palace and thought about where to begin. She read a list. I said. 14 items. The last one was about the reorientation procedure. And then they told me to kneel in front of the whole court, formally on record, for transmission to every system in the Imperium. Silence. And you said. I said I wasn't in a position to accept the terms. I paused, and then I left. The quiet on the line stretched for a long moment. Calvin, the director said finally. Yes, I told you to do that if things ever got to an ultimatum point. I told you that 3 years ago as a theoretical framework. No, I did not think. She stopped. Started again. I did not expect it to actually happen this quickly. It happened today. I said. Another pause. Are you all right? I considered the question seriously, which was something I had not had a spare moment to do since leaving the throne room. Yes, I said. I'm calm actually, which is either a good sign or a concerning one. Haven't made contact yet. Any back channel traffic? Nothing so far. We've been in transit for about 8 minutes. We'll have the corridor closure order ready to transmit the moment you confirm you want it sent. Legal has had the paperwork prepared for 6 months. A pause. Calvin, this is going to create a very significant situation. I know that. Dervani will move. The Asrai will move. Everyone who's been waiting to see whether the Veilif were as untouchable as they appeared is going to start recalibrating. That is what I am counting on. The line was quiet again. Then she said, transmit the corridor closure order. I pressed the authorization on my device. Done, I said. Then get some rest, she said. Tomorrow is going to be very loud. She closed the line. I set down the device and looked out at the stars again. The palace was a small shape now, distant. Just another point of light among thousands. Somewhere inside it, in a throne room designed to make anyone who entered feel small, an empress who had never in her reign encountered the word no was sitting with the reality that a human being from a civilization she had considered an afterthought had just Walked out of her court, I did not feel triumphant. Triumph is loud, and I was not a loud mood. I felt more than anything the very specific satisfaction of a person who has done a difficult thing that needed doing and done it well, and now has to wait to see what the world does in response. I closed my eyes. The shuttle moved through the dark between stars, and I let myself be still. And I did not think about any of it for a while. Lena Graves was right about one thing. The next morning was loud. I was a helium station by the time the first signal started arriving. Helium was a transit hub, neutral ground, technically administered by a joint council of 4 species, practically managed by whoever was willing to do the paperwork, and it had the best open communications network. Within 12 light hours of Olive space, I had a room there, a functional box with a viewport and a desk and a bed that was slightly too short for me, which I've been using as a secondary base for the past year. I made myself coffee from the small machine I kept on the desk. The station had food facilities, but the coffee from those was not worth the walk. I sat down with the mug and opened the communications feed and read. The corridor closure order had transmitted at 3:40 station time. By 700 it had been acknowledged by 6 Olive Supply Fleet commanders and refused by 2. The 2 refusals were noted, logged, and forwarded to the Commission's legal team, who would handle them through the standard interstellar freight arbitration process. This would take between 8 and 14 months. During that time, the ships in question were not legally permitted to transit one of the 6 supply fleets that had acknowledged the closure was the 7th Imperial Agricultural Convoy, 43 vessels carrying processed grain and nutrient compounds to 14 colonies in the Imperium's eastern cluster without Kessel Corridor transit access. They were looking at a journey of 9 additional weeks through secondary routes, during which their perishable cargo would degrade significantly. I read that and felt briefly a small flicker of regret. Colonies at the end of those routes were full of ordinary people who had nothing to do with the politics of their Empress. I had done the math before making the decision, and the math said the convoy would not face actual shortage. They had buffer reserves and the secondary routes, while long, were viable, but the situation was not comfortable, and I was aware of it. I put the feeling in a box and kept reading. By 900, I had received 3 formal communication requests from species I had been cultivating quietly for the past 2 years. The first was from the Dravani Compact's trade liaison, a being named Veth, who communicated through a translator that rendered everything in careful, slightly old-fashioned phrasing. The message was 17 seconds long. Veth spent 14 of those seconds expressing regret for the brevity necessitated by the urgency of the matter. 3 seconds of actual content. In galactic diplomatic terms, this was practically an emergency declaration. The Dravani wanted to talk today, if possible tomorrow at the latest. The second was from the Osirai Collective, a species I'd met only twice in person, but whose representative I had exchanged careful, encrypted correspondence with for 14 months. Their message was 2 sentences. They were aware of recent developments and wished to explore new frameworks for cooperation. 2 sentences from the Osirai was the equivalent of a 5-page proposal from anyone else. They did not waste words. The third was from a species called the Pellini, whom I had not personally engaged with, but who had a long and unhappy history with the Valeth dating back 4 generations. Their message was longer and more emotional in tone, and it included a phrase that my translation device rendered as something close to "we knew someone would do it eventually." I read all 3 messages twice, then I opened a new file and started drafting replies. I was careful with each one. I did not promise anything. I did not suggest that what had happened in the throne room was the beginning of an alliance or a formal realignment of galactic relationships. I acknowledged their messages with warmth and expressed genuine interest in conversation. I suggested dates. I kept the language open and the commitments absent. This was, as it turned out, exactly the right approach, because at 1100 the 4th message arrived. It was from the Valeth Imperium, not from the Empress, from the Office of Imperial Relations, a bureaucratic body that handled mid-level communications, the kind of office that processed permits and handled minor disputes, and was not, under any normal circumstances, the office that communicated with a foreign diplomatic envoy after what had happened yesterday. The use of that office was itself a signal they were not ready to respond at the level the situation deserved, because doing so would require acknowledging that the situation had happened and they were not ready to do that yet. So they sent it through the smallest, most technically appropriate channel they could find. The message was framed as a request for clarification. They wanted to understand whether Earth's withdrawal of its diplomatic presence was temporary or permanent, and whether the corridor closure was intended as a trade measure or as something else. I read the message 3 times, then I called Lena Graves. She answered immediately. It was mid-afternoon in Geneva. They wrote, I said, when? About 20 minutes ago, through the Office of Imperial Relations. A pause. Not the Foreign Affairs Directorate. No, I heard her exhale slowly. They're scared, she said. They're careful, I said. There's a difference for them. Right now, those are the same thing. She paused. What did they say? They want to know if the closure is temporary. What are you going to say? I looked out the viewport at the stars. Helium Station's orbital position gave a clear view of the outer ring, where 4 different species ships were docked in a row, their identification lights blinking in different colors and rhythms against the dark. I'm going to say we're currently reviewing our diplomatic posture, I said. A pause. Then Lena made a small sound. That's not an answer. Exactly, I said. She was quiet for a moment. Draft it and send it to me. Before you transmit, I want to read the wording, of course. And Calvin, are you eating, sleeping? I slept 4 hours. I had coffee. That is not what I asked. I'll eat, I said. Good. A pause. This is going well. I need you to know that whatever comes next, what happened yesterday was the right thing. The commission is behind you. I know, I said. Do you actually know that, or are you saying it because it's what you're supposed to say? I considered the question. Both, I said, in roughly equal proportions. She laughed, which was unusual for her, and closed the line. I sat with the quiet for a moment. Then I pulled up a fresh document and began composing my reply to the Office of Imperial Relations. I wrote 3 sentences. The first acknowledged receipt of their communication. The second stated that Earth was currently engaged in a comprehensive review of its Diplomatic posture with regard to all. Interstellar partnerships, the third. Wished them a productive cycle. I read it twice, added nothing, removed nothing, sent it to Lena 12 minutes. Later she sent it back with one word. Perfect. I transmitted it, then I went and found something to eat because she had been right about that, and because I had a feeling the next several weeks were going to require more energy than I currently had. I was not wrong. The next 3 weeks moved the way large events always do, fast in some directions, agonizingly slow in others, and completely unpredictable in the ones you thought you had mapped out. Day 3. The Dravani Compact formally requested observer status in the Kessel Corridor. This was a significant move. Observer status was a stepping stone toward transit agreements, and transit agreements were the kind of relationship the Valeth Imperium viewed as exclusively theirs to grant. The Dravani were not asking the Valeth for permission, they were asking Earth. I approved a preliminary discussion meeting and kept the confirmation brief. Day 5. 2 of the Valeth's own subject species, minor partners rather than full member states of the Imperium, sent quiet unofficial inquiries to Helium Station addressed to the Earth Diplomatic Office. Both were technically within the Imperium's sphere of influence. Both were reaching out in ways their Empress would not have sanctioned. I noted this carefully and did not respond immediately. Day 7. Lena called to tell me that 3 members of the Earth Interstellar Commission's board who had been opposed to my posting from the beginning on the grounds that a human presence in Valeth space was more risk than reward had reversed their positions. She said this with the particular dry satisfaction of someone who had spent a long time being right about something and was now watching the people who disagreed with her update their views in real time. I asked her how the public was responding. She told me that most people on Earth did not follow interstellar diplomatic developments closely, which was fair, but that the story had broken through in ways she had not expected. Someone had obtained a partial record of the throne room session, not the full recording, just the final exchange, my departure, and the subsequent silence, and it had moved through Earth's networks very quickly. What are they saying? I asked. Many things, she said, mostly good. Tell me the bad ones. Some people think you made a unilateral decision that could endanger 11 billion people. That's a fair concern. I know. I've been addressing it. The Commission authorized the action retroactively this morning, which makes it formally sanctioned. That should quiet most of the noise. A pause. Calvin, someone wrote a piece about you. It ran on 3 major networks. What kind of piece? The kind where you come across as either very brave or very reckless, depending on which paragraph you stop reading at. Which are you going with? Both, she said, in roughly equal proportions. I laughed. It was the first real laugh I had managed in a week, and it felt good. On day 9, a second message came from the Valeth Imperium. This one was from a different office, the Office of Strategic Relations, which was one level below the Foreign Affairs Directorate, still not the top level, but closer. The message was longer and more careful in its phrasing, and it used the word regrettable 4 times, which I counted with the particular attention of someone who knows that in Valeth diplomatic language, repetition of a word is not emphasis, it is the written equivalent of a lowered posture. They wanted to meet. They were describing it as a clarifying session, neutral ground. Date that was 4 weeks out. I read it. To Lena over the line, she said. They're not ready to call it what it is. No, I said, but they're moving. What do you want to do? I thought about it. 4 weeks was a long time. Long enough for the Drevani discussions to progress. Long enough for the Asurai collective to formalize their inquiry. Long enough for the small, quiet rearrangements happening across the region to become a little more settled, a little more real. I'll confirm the meeting, I said, but not the date. A pause. You're going to make them wait, not punishingly long. I'll suggest 2 weeks later than their proposed date. I'll give a reason about scheduling conflicts. It will be polite and completely unbelievable, and they will accept it. A moment of quiet. All right, Lena said. I sent the reply that afternoon. I was polite, warm, and vague about the delay. I suggested a date 6 weeks out rather than the Valeth has proposed for. I offered 3 alternative venues, all of them slightly more inconvenient for the Valeth delegation than for mine. They accepted within 2 hours. I noted this. That evening I sat at the viewport in my room at Helium Station and looked at the stars for a long time. I thought about the Empress in her throne room. I thought about the look on her face in those final seconds before I turned, the expression that was not quite disbelief and not quite anger, but something underneath both of those, something more private, something that looked very briefly like recalculation. I'd not done this to humiliate her. That mattered to me, and it is worth being clear about. She was the product of a system and a tradition that had worked perfectly well for 4 centuries, and nothing in that tradition had prepared her for a species that would simply decline to play the expected role. She was not cruel in any simple way. She was powerful, and power has its own kind of blindness, and what I had done was not punish her for that blindness, but simply refuse to let it work on me. The difference mattered, at least to me. I thought about the 6 weeks ahead, the meetings that would need to happen, the careful language that would need to be written, relationships I had built over 3 years that were about to bear a very different kind of weight than I had originally imagined when I built them. I thought about a conversation I had once had with my father years ago. Before any of this, he was a civil engineer. He built bridges over rivers and places where no one had thought to put a bridge before. He had told me once that the most important thing about a bridge was not the materials or the design or the engineering. It was the choice of where to put it. You built it where the crossing was necessary, where people were already trying to get across and failing, where the river was real and the need was real, and all that was missing was the structure. You do not build a bridge to prove you can, he had said. You build it because without it people cannot get where they need to go. I had thought about that conversation a lot over the past 3 years, about what it means to create a crossing between things that do not naturally connect, about patience, about the long work of making something that will outlast the moment that made it necessary. I thought about it again. Now, then I went to bed because tomorrow would be early and busy, and I had a bridge to finish building. The meeting was held on a station called Vareth Crossing 3 weeks earlier than originally agreed. The Vareth had asked to move the day forward. They had framed the request as a scheduling inconvenience. I had said yes without making them ask twice because there was no strategic benefit in making them wait longer and some practical benefit in resolving things quickly, and because I had never wanted to punish them, I had only wanted them to understand something. I was fairly confident they understood it now. Varith Crossing was a small station by galactic standards, a hub of modest size operated jointly by 3 neutral species positioned at the intersection of 2 secondary shipping routes that the Valith did not control and the Dravani did not control and nobody owned. In any complete sense, it was the kind of place that existed because the galaxy needed places where things could happen without a flag attached. The meeting room they had arranged was notably a round room, no raised platform, no throne position, a circular table with seats of equal height, light coming from overhead panels set to a neutral spectrum that flattered no species particular. 7 seats on each side, though I had brought only 2 advisors and a translator. The Valith side had 12 people, but only the first voice spoke. Her name was Varithal. She was older than the Empress and moved with the particular economy of someone who'd spent most of a long career in rooms exactly like this one. She sat down before I did. I was told later by someone who studied Valith court etiquette at a level I respected that this was an extraordinarily significant gesture in the formal hierarchy of Valith diplomatic tradition. The person who sat first was the one conceding the position of waiting, which was the subordinate position. Varithal had sat down first. She had made herself the one who waited for me. At the time, I simply thanked her and took my seat. She opened the session by saying that there had been a failure of mutual understanding in the previous exchange and that the Imperium wished to address this in Valith formal language. This was an apology, not an informal one, a specific technical formal acknowledgement that something had gone wrong. That was the Imperium's responsibility to address. I had read enough of their legal text to know the phrase she had used and what it cost someone in her position to say it. I received it with a slight incline of my head and said that Earth looked forward to building a clearer shared foundation. Going forward, then we got to work. 6 hours, the table between us was covered in documents by hour 2. Translation devices ran constantly, the soft clicking and murmuring of real-time conversion filling the room like a quiet engine. My 2 advisors, Petra Osmond and Cal Finch. Cal was not related to me. We had made the joke once and agreed not to make it again. Handled the legal language with a kind of focused precision that made me glad I had brought them. The Valith team was good. Varithal was exceptionally good. She was not here to surrender, and she was not here to perform. She was here to reach an agreement that both sides could actually live with, and she pursued that goal with professional determination that I genuinely respected. By hour 4, we had the core framework in place. Earth retained full sovereign control of all 6 settled worlds and all frontier systems. The 3 systems named in the original ultimatum, Pelin, Corin, and the Marsh Reach, were explicitly listed in the agreement as outside the scope of any future administrative discussion. Valith vessels would have access to the Kessel Corridor under a formal transit agreement with fees, schedules, and terms that were mutual and transparent. Earth's diplomatic presence in the Imperium would resume under a new protocol that did not include the reorientation procedure. That last point had taken 40 minutes to negotiate. Verithal had tried 3 different framings of the procedure before, accepting that we were not going to agree to any version of it. She did not push hard. I think she had known before. She sat down that it was not on the table. In the final hour, I raised the clause I had planned since the beginning. Of all of this, I had drafted it 11 times. I had shown it to Lena, into the Commission's legal team, into 2 independent experts in interstellar treaty law. I had refined it until it was precise without being aggressive, clear without being condescending. I called it the mutual partnership standard provision. Its language stated that neither party would present the other with demands framed as ultimatums, involving acts of symbolic subjugation, and that any such demand, if made, would constitute a material the treaty and automatically void all provisions. I slid the document across the table to Verithal. She read it without expression, then she read it again. Room was quiet. She looked up at me. "You want this in the treaty?" she said. "Yes." A pause. "This clause applies to both parties," she said. "Yes," I said. "It does. Earth is also bound by it." She looked at the document again. Then she passed it to the legal advisor on her right, who read it quickly and leaned in to speak quietly. Verithal listened, nodded once, and looked back at me. "I will need a short recess to consult," she said. "Of course," I said. The recess was 11 minutes. When Verithal returned, she sat down and placed the document on the table between us and said, "The Imperium accepts this provision." I kept my face neutral and professional. Inside, very quietly, something settled. We spent the final 40 minutes on language refinement and signing protocol. Verithal was thorough about the protocol. The Velith were always thorough about signing ceremonies, even simple ones, and I had learned to respect this rather than find it tedious. There was meaning in the ceremony for them. The care they put into it was a form of sincerity. When the documents were signed and the session was formally closed, Verithal and I stood at the same moment. She looked at me for a moment with a large, dark eyes of species I'd spent 3 years learning to read, and I looked back. She said in a register I had not heard from her before, quieter, less formal, more like one person speaking to another, rather than 2 officials concluding a session. "You knew we would contact you." It was not quite a question. "I hope you would," I said. She considered this. "How long did you expect to wait?" I thought about the honest answer and decided to give it. "I didn't know," I said, "but I was prepared to wait as long as it took." Another pause. "You were not afraid," she said. I thought about how to answer that carefully. "I was afraid," I said, "but it did not change the decision." Something shifted in her expression, very slightly. I was not fluent enough in veiled faces to name it. She inclined her head, a small gesture, but from someone in her position in this context it carried more weight than anything that had been said in 6 hours of negotiation. I inclined mine in return. Then we both turned and went in separate directions, and the meeting was over. My shuttle back to Helium left an hour later. I sat in the same seat I had sat in on the flight away from the Chrysalis Palace, and I looked out the viewport at Veiled Crossing's navigation lights as they shrank with distance, and I opened my personal log for the first time in 6 Weeks I had kept the log since the beginning of my posting. Not for official purposes, the commission had its own records, but for myself. A place to put things that did not belong in reports. I wrote one line. We did not win by fighting, we won by knowing when not to kneel. I closed the log. Outside the viewport, the stars were everywhere, the same ones I had looked at from the throne room walkway, from my room at Helium Station, from every moment in between where I had asked myself whether I had done the right thing and arrived each time at the same answer. The corridor was open. The treaty was signed. The Dravani were talking. The Asari were moving. 3 species that had spent decades waiting to see whether the Valeth's grip on the region was as permanent as it appeared were now in the early stages of learning that it was not. And Earth, 11 billion people across 6 worlds, civilization that the galaxy had mostly overlooked until recently, had a diplomatic agreement with the most powerful empire in 40 star systems that contained in plain language a guarantee that no one would ever ask one of us to kneel again. I thought about what my father had said about bridges, about building them where people are already trying to cross. I thought about the Empress in her throne room, watching me walk away. I wonder what she was doing now, whether she had read the treaty, whether in some quiet part of her understanding she had registered what had actually happened, not a defeat exactly, but a shift, a change in the shape of things, the beginning of a different kind of relationship than the one she had inherited. I hope so. Not out of sentiment, out of practicality. The treaty only worked if both sides wanted it to, but I also knew this, the clause was in there and it would stay in there. And every time a human being sat down at a table in that corner of the galaxy for the next 100 years, they would sit down with the formal, legally binding knowledge that the ground under their feet was their own. That mattered. My translator was sitting in my jacket pocket, still warm from 6 hours of continuous use. My copy of the signed agreement was in my briefcase, 2 inches of printed documents that would be scanned, digitized, and archived. The moment I reached Helium, my hands were still, my breathing was even. I was very tired. I was also, in a way I had not expected and could not entirely explain, at peace. Petra appeared from the forward cabin with 2 cups of something hot and handed one to me without a word. I thanked her. She nodded and went back to her seat. Outside, the stars drifted slowly past as the shuttle accelerated toward the transit point. I drank the coffee. It was not as good as the kind from my room machine. It was fine. Some things do not need to be exceptional to be exactly what you need. I closed my eyes and let the steady hum of the engines carry me home.